record the so just to let everyone know, this is going to be a recorded webinar, and if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We will answer questions at the very end. And so just to make sure that we can get through our entire presentation, I'm sure there are plenty of questions to be had about invasives, because I have tons of questions. Francis knows I have plenty of questions all the time. But we're all learning together here. So we'll just get started. Welcome to our landowner workshop, Protecting Your Land from Invasive Plants. This is being put on by Scenic Rivers Land Trust, and this is funded by the Mars Foundation. So thank you, Mars Foundation, for adding funding for this. Our speakers are going to be me as mostly the moderator, but introducing you to Scenic Rivers Land Trust. I'm the Executive Director of Scenic Rivers Land Trust. Evan McGee is Scenic Rivers Land Trust Stewardship Coordinator, and he is also the main instigator of our Healthy Forest program, which is he is out with volunteers all the time, helping Bacon Ridge get a little healthier from all of its invasive problems. We also have Nina Fisher, who has plenty of titles, including Master Watershed Steward, Master Naturalist, and one of the founders of the Save Our Trees program, which is under the Watershed Stewards Academy right now, that has saved over 1,000 trees from English ivy over the last year or two. And we also have the amazing Francis Smith, our local forester, who is really tuned into forest health and agroecology, and is also a musician on the side. So he has been a huge help in us getting our Healthy Forest program off the ground and continuing just trying to make it even better than it already is. And so our agenda today is just a quick introduction of Scenic Rivers and our Healthy Forest program. Then we'll get into vines and how to best control them, and herbicide best practices. Then we'll get into these shrubs, and then hopefully we'll have enough time for question and answer at the very end. So a quick introduction to Scenic Rivers Land Trust. If you've never heard of us before, we have been around for 30 years, and we are a private 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to protect the natural and scenic areas in Anne Arundel County. We mostly do this through conservation easements, which is a legal agreement between a landowner and a land trust. So if you're interested in conserving your land, I am always happy to talk land conservation. So please send me an email or give me a call. We have over 78 conservation easements on almost 4,000 acres in the county. And our three main programs is conservation, as I just mentioned, and also stewardship. So checking in on all of our conservation easements every year, and helping our landowners protect their forests and the conservation values that we care about, like invasives and doing stream restoration and things like that. And our last program is outreach and education, which is this webinar fits really well into. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Evan McGee to introduce our Healthy Forest program.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody, for being here. This is so much fun to do and talk to the community and see what you're thinking about, worry about, and just to tell you more about what we're working on, because we're doing some very cool things. So one of our greatest and best programs that we have that our small team is working on is called the Healthy Forests program. And it's basically just our best to tackle the invasive plant species that are dominating lots of areas and are all throughout our easements and all over the county. And so we've targeted specific areas, and we are focusing on Bacon Ridge Natural Area for this program mostly. It's a huge, wonderful 1,200 acre park right in the middle of the county, right in Crownsville, that offers biking, hiking, lots of great stuff for the family. It's one of the most beautiful parts of our county. And we have a conservation easement on 650 acres of it. So it's our responsibility to steward it, do our best to keep the forest healthy. And we love getting out there into the woods and showing people how cool this place is. So we started this a couple years ago, this specific program, and it's been going very strong. We've had some really good turnout this year, which first year of me in the program. that involved a couple public days. We scheduled once a month, had some public outreach to get anybody who wanted to come by. And then we also operated private days for things for organizations like churches, youth groups, some schools were involved. We got a great couple corporate programs out there. A lot of people came out, and this year we've had 98 individual volunteers so far this year. We've targeted areas. We've got a big 90-acre area we're working on that'll be part contractor, but part volunteer. But so far, we've gotten about a half acre done this spring. So that took 700 pounds and 230 hours to get about a half acre done from volunteer work. So still lots of work to do. And then we've got contractors out there handling the big stuff, the stuff we can't get to that's either hard to access or it's so big that volunteers, it's just too much for us. So that's what we're working on with this Healthy Forest program. Francis has been out with us. Nina's a big part of it. We got a great team of volunteers that come out, and that's what we're trying to do to give back a little bit. So that gives a quick synopsis of the Healthy Forest program. Now we're going to talk about some of the plants that we do see throughout this easement, throughout a lot of easements. We've got some great experts here to help you, and can't wait to hear what they're going to say. So let's get started with the most pesky and virulent, I think, are vines. And here to talk to you about that is our wonderful guest, Nina.
Hi, everybody. Just a little caveat before I start. I'm just getting over COVID, so if my mind wanders or if I'm just not making sense, please ask me a question because I'm still in the really tired part of COVID. But anyway, vines are hugely disruptive to our natural ecosystem. But before we get into the bad stuff, I just want to point out that there actually are some really good vines, and they're they're native, and the forests have co-evolved with them. We have poison ivy, which none of us like, but provides good habitat and wildlife food value. There's Virginia creeper, there's native grapevine. All these things are okay, but sometimes when they're on top of all the invasive stuff, it can just be too much. So mostly I'm going to concentrate here on the bad vines, which do all sorts of terrible things. And it doesn't take long if you just look around when you're walking anywhere in the county, you can see evidence of vines overtaking our tree canopy. They sometimes will girdle the trees, bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle. You can actually see trees that have these spirals going up because those trees have at one time had some bittersweet or honeysuckle growing up them, which impedes them bringing moisture and nutrients up to the crown of the tree. They can overtop the trees. They can slow down photosynthesis. If they're on the ground, native plants can't really get a hold and flourish on the forest floor. All sorts of wildlife is impacted because when you don't have the native plants, then you don't get the native bugs and insects. And then those all support the native wildlife. So it's really a domino effect that these vines have, and they're not just physical effects on the trees themselves, but a ripple effect all the way up to the ecosystem, up to ecosystem level. And one thing they do is, we don't really think about it, but trees add a lot of weight, or especially things like English ivy vine add a lot of weight to trees, which means that they can topple over, especially during windstorms. And I brought my show and tell. Believe it or not, this is not a tree trunk. This is a chunk of ivy. This is the stem of an ivy, and it's about 6 inches high and maybe 4 or 5 inches wide. And this little piece weighs 2.5 pounds. So if you can imagine this all the way around a tree and then extending up into the canopy, that's just hundreds or thousands of pounds of weight hanging on that tree that's just trying to grow. They can also harbor mosquitoes and ticks and create diversity loss and hold moisture against the tree bark. So they're bad in so many ways. But vines in general will grow wherever they get a chance to grow. It's not just one area, but they tend to love forest edges. So they get enough sunlight being at the edge of the forest, but they have the trees still there to be able to climb up them. So that area and disturbed areas are all areas where you might tend to see invasive vine growth, but then they'll move into the forest too. So they're not just they're not restricted to that kind of area, and they're very versatile and they can grow under a wide range of conditions. There's 3 methods of removal. Mostly we're going to talk about the mechanical. I'm going to talk about mechanical. Francis is going to talk about chemical and biological. There are some biological controls like goats, but most of us as personal landowners don't have goats in our backyard. So there are other biological means, but largely mechanical and chemical are the 2 that you're going to be using as your go-to methods. Mechanically, with seedlings in particular, the easiest thing to do is just take your weeding fork or your gloved hand and go out there and yank all the babies out by their roots. It gets a little bit harder when they're mature vines, because these mature vines, sometimes, like in this case, you're not just going to yank this out of the ground. So you need to concentrate on a specific method of dissuading the trees, the vines from going up the trees, or at least stopping their climb up the trees. And so I'm going to go over the English ivy method in the next slide, but before we do that, so I'll give you the way to tackle mature vines, but we're going to do that in the next slide. Disposal of vines, you can do a lot of things with these things. With the English ivy and some of the others, as long as their roots are exposed to air, they're going to desiccate and die. So sometimes people will bag them all up. I think that just takes a lot of time from not actually cutting the vines. So I tend to have them in piles that I align perpendicular to slopes, so that they also serve as little stormwater breaks as well. But just don't put any dirt on top of the vines that you pull, because you don't want them rerouting. In cases like Japanese knotweed, which we're not talking about today, that can reroot so easily that you want to dispose of them in a different way. So make sure that your disposal is appropriate for the type of vine that you're tackling. So let's move on to the next slide. That's you, Francis.
Okie dokie. Thank you all for having me, and just thank you for caring enough to come and listen and try to learn more with us. So I'm just going to go over some of the basic things as far as chemical application goes, and then a little more specific. But with any sort of chemicals, I mean, I just read the label, and read the label again. And it's just about safety and the timing of the application being right. So the first thing is really just about us in acronym world, PPE, but just protective equipment for yourself. So keeping your eyes covered, mask, gloves, really just no exposed skin. You're going to be long sleeves and pants when you're dealing with any kind of herbicide. And if you just think about the movement of chemicals, wind and water. So, I mean, if it's going to be windy or it's going to be wet, you really just want a dry week, no wind, no rain in the forecast. Optimum temperatures are usually like 65 to 85, and right in kind of in the smack dab in the middle of that for maximum effectiveness. And I'm really just going to be talking kind of like application for any homeowner resident. So just over the counter stuff you would have at Home Depot or Lowe's. A lot of my colleagues have like the applicator's license, and they're dealing with some different concentrations and mixes, and a little more broader range of species and habitats that they're applying in. And it's kind of interesting. I did a little bit of research asking around, but most of our foresters, you'll see some folks with some different time frames, but really with any woody stem vine, it's really the mid to late growing season, like midsummer to fall, as the best window for what would be systemic herbicide application. And it's cut stem or foliar application that you would do. The cut stem is essentially just cutting it as close to the ground as you can, and say if it's on a tree, as high as you can, but you apply the herbicide immediately to that stem end that's going into the ground. You wait kind of later into the season, as maybe the leaves are changing color, the plant's drawing energy down to its roots. And that's where you want that systemic herbicide to get down to be effective. Some of my folks say there's another small window for application for cut stem, in the midwinter, before the plant really starts moving sap back up into the canopy. But that mid to late growing season is typically the best time, and it's usually cut stem or foliar. That is really going to depend on, do you have a situation where you have vegetation you don't want to lose, where so maybe you don't want to do a foliar spray where you're going to lose some other vegetation in the area. Cut stem is going to be the most direct when you have some native vegetation in the spray zone. And even the timing, you know, some folks would maybe wait later into the season, because if you think about having all your skin covered and all that, maybe just for your own comfort and moving around the woods and getting to what you need to treat later in the season is kind of like the optimal time. And when I said foliar, it's usually soaking the leaves, but not to the point of like dripping off, running off. The really two active ingredient chemicals that are like the main ones that folks go to, and I mean, it's glyphosate and triclopyr. The main thing to caution really is glyphosate is non-selective, meaning you can burn up other vegetation in the spray area, where triclopyr is a selective, and you'll be able to maybe keep some grasses and conifers in the zone that you're spraying. But again, it really depends like what kind of situation you have with the vines. But that's kind of the two standard approaches for herbicide application. And again, it's really just about safety. It's going to be variable, and I'll mention when we get into individual species, but I just wanted to give sort of the general chemical application talk. And typically the foliar spray, it's like a 2% solution of the herbicide mixed with the water. And cut stem, you'll see in a lot of the Fish and Wildlife Service guidance that it's a 25% solution of herbicide with the water. And as far as the infestation, that's going to tell you what approach you can do in case you have natives that you really want to hold on to there. Sometimes these vines are so bad you have really no other option. And if you have an odd situation where it's a wet zone, I think it's rodeo is something that maybe you would get at a Home Depot or Lowe's, and Habitat is another one designed for treatment only in a wetland, a wet area. Because that's very, you do not, it's all about safety, and just look at the conditions, protect yourself, but you also want to protect that existing landscape around you in the process.
Thanks, Francis. I really appreciate that overview. And in Bacon Ridge, we strongly favor the cut stem method, so that we can be very selective and very cautious on where we put it, since there is so many good native plants right next door. So to get into it, I think Nina is going to start us off with English ivy,
which is the bane of my existence, but at least it gives me a reason for living. So English ivy, I don't think I need to go into a lot of detail about how to ID it. Most of you probably have already seen it, but it actually was brought here in the early 1700s. A lot of the invasive plants came a long time ago, when people brought them from Europe thinking, oh, well, that would make a nice ground cover, or this plant will remind me of home. It's got the dark waxy green leaves, and it can vary. The morphology of the leaf can vary a lot. And when it's low down to the ground or just climbing up the tree is probably the way we recognize it most easily. But as it climbs up the tree, it changes, the leaf shape changes. And it's only when it gets high up in the tree and it becomes mature that it starts to berry. And so berrying is not what we want, because those berries can be eaten by birds and then distributed, far and wide. And if you're trying to really minimize the extent to which ivy is taking over an area, you want to make sure to really get those berries not maturing up high. So that would be one reason to really tackle a tree that has a lot of mature ivy going up it. So to remove it, what you want to, I've got a picture here. That's the first one is the obviously the shape of it. The other is we call our abominable ivy man, because this is in West Annapolis and it looks a lot like a snowman to me anyway. You can see how when it's just completely taken over this tree and compromised it. And there's a lot of moisture being held next to the bark. This tree is going to die unless someone helps remove the ivy from it. To remove it, what we do at Save Our Trees is mostly about 3 or 4 feet or up above the ground. We will create a ring all the way around the tree and use pruners or loppers. In some cases, the mini chainsaws, which are incredible little instruments. I don't know if you guys have ever seen one, but the blade is about 4 inches long, and it's really handy for getting 2 and 3 inch ivy stems and cutting through them. So that when you cut through those ivy stems, what you're doing is severing the connection of the stuff up high from the stuff down low, so that nutrients and water cannot move up and down, or up the ivy stem to nourish the ivy at the top. Once you do that, if it's really huge, you're probably just going to have to create a second cut, maybe a foot down below that, another ring around that, and pull it away from the tree so that you have a zone of life just about this wide that at least creates a belt where the ivy is not going to be able to grow. It will grow from the base of those stems, but if you don't have a means to pull them out, you need to focus on just cutting off the nutrients and water to the top. And don't pull from the canopy at all, because these trees are already compromised. If you're going to pull, you may be pulling down a branch. You might be pulling down the entire tree on yourself, which is not something you want. If they're smaller, if the stems are smaller and you can pull down off of the tree from about 3 or 4 feet high and pull it down and pull it away out of the dirt, away from the base of the tree, then create a ring of life around the base of the tree, a foot or 2 wide, so that the ivy can immediately start growing back up the tree. In a lot of cases, we're not eradicating the problem, we're just trying to deal with the worst of it. And so I would say that you want to do that. Later, you'll want to keep monitoring so that you can clip back any regrowth, and you want to clip down any or pull out any tiny seedlings that reappear, because as I said, with the berries, you might get rid of all the ivy on your land, but the guy next to you might still have it. And so you're going to get regrowth from berries coming from their trees. And so, yeah, I think there was one more thing that oh, you also see that ivy grows a lot on the ground. Generally, it's not terrible on the ground. It's not a great ground cover because the roots are shallow. It also suppresses native vegetation, but at least for us, the focus is saving the trees, and by cutting the ivy on the trees themselves and worrying less about the stuff on the ground, we're really performing, with pun intended, triage, and going for the most important compromising factor first, and that's getting it off the trees and killing it so that it will die back over the next several months. And don't be discouraged if you don't see immediate death of these ivy. These trunks can be big. There's a lot of moisture already in them. It might take several months for you to see the leaves up high desiccate and dry, and then they will slowly fall off. All right, then moving on to Japanese honeysuckle. This was introduced a little bit later in the 1800s. You can see we could have our colonial ancestors to thank for a lot of these problems that we're experiencing today. This is one of the ones that twines around the tree trunk, and you can and really can compromise the growth of the tree as it tries to get bigger. The young stems tend to be green and a little bit fuzzy. The older stems will get more woody looking and hollow, and they'll have some peeling bark on them. But most distinctive of these of Japanese honeysuckle is the flowers that I don't know about all you guys, but as a kid, I loved them because you could pull them off and then snip the end with your teeth and get just a drop of nectar that tasted shockingly like honeysuckle. So it's in that way it's kind of reminiscent of well, at least it's reminiscent of childhood for me, though I don't really like what's doing to our ecosystem. So removing again the small stuff, if you can pull it out by hand pulling, that's the best. Sometimes, and like you can see in this photo, but down below, it's just overtaking everything in that picture, including the housing structure. So you might be inclined to mow it, but sometimes you can do more damage than good by mowing, because if you stimulate growth, it can just kind of you tamp it down and then it will just overwhelm you several weeks or months later. Some people prescribe a burn for it. I don't want to get into how you would burn down honeysuckle. Herbicides are a possibility, but basically the best thing to do is just getting it out by the roots, and trying to maintain an area that you've freed from this vegetation, trying to maintain it as an area without vines, and then later, if you can, plant natives there to kind of keep the other non-natives at bay.
Okie dokie. I'll jump in and thank you, Nina. And basically, all the manual approaches would be the same as far as cutting and removing these vines off of the trees, and as well as the manual, the grubbing, the hand pulling them out. And especially after, say, like what's coming this weekend and all that rain, after that system, prime time to go and pull some things out of the ground. It's the best time to go at it. And in general, sometimes I tell landowners, like during that drought period we had, again, an approach to kind of attack plants when they're all stressed out from like unfavorable weather conditions. So sometimes on the organic end, I have to get a bit more creative. So this is the bane of my existence. It's kind of good, like the way that lined up, because bittersweet is just been a nightmare on my property for a long time. And I will say, over the 10 years I've been with the Forest Service, this one has migrated the most throughout the state. I'm Anne Arundel based, but I cover the whole state for work, and I've seen it march west over 10 years pretty quickly into different streamside forest settings and just all over. But this one and another shrub called autumn olive are kind of the two I've seen migrate throughout the state. So for bittersweet ID, the leaves, there's really not anything that stands out too much other than them sort of being round, and they can be glossy. They're alternate leaves, but similar to English ivy, the morphology, I've seen them be a little different depending on how much sunlight they get. The reason this one is a beast is because it really can thrive in shade. We build forest stands a lot of time because landowners get tired of cutting grass, but we also want to shade out just noxious weeds and different invasives. And bittersweet, it'll just thrive and just love shade. The berries are really usually the best indicator, where you'll see this sort of yellowish aril, which is ARIL. This is a soft covering outside of the berry, and the berry gets to be like a red, really bright red later into the season from July, and can really linger into October. When you pull young bittersweet seedlings, you'll see very orange color roots. So that's how I know I'm always right when I'm pulling them out of but I've just been staring at these things so long in the understory. I know even the smallest one I can identify. You can have old stems that can get about 4 inches in diameter, and it'll have like a gray brown kind of furrowed bark. But really, whatever you do, you just want to get to it when you're cutting, like before the seed sets. And the seed of this species can be viable for about a year, but there's when it comes to seed lifespan, that's a whole nother presentation. But I just like to tell people how long the seeds would linger in your environment in case they would germinate. Since I did discuss the chemical, I just wanted to note that again, it's not really anything different. It would be the midsummer to mid-September cut stem approach. And it's really about applying that herbicide immediately after you cut that stem. I mean, if you cut it and then you think you can come back the day after, then, you just wasted your time walking around the woods. You got to cut it and apply immediately. If the vines are big enough, there's a technique called hack and squirt. You just make this cut into the plant tissue, and herbicide that would have triclopyr as its active ingredient is typically the best for that. Foliar, I guess, if you just have like low bittersweet vine cover on the ground. But I really am just pretty vigilant about hand pulling and getting all of the root mass out of the ground. And as I say, using Mother Nature to your favor and doing it after rainstorms. And I typically can get it out pretty good. It's taken me 2 seasons before, but it's rewarding when you beat it. So it's worth it to me. Okay, the next one would be kudzu. So bittersweet's actually been referred as the kudzu of the north, but we have kudzu here too. You'll see it with these 3 leaflet groups, and really the best is probably when it flowers. It's got like a really kind of pretty, like showy reddish purple flower. It's 1/2 inch long, maybe on average, and late summer, early fall. It can grow from like runners, rhizomes, just nodes that touch the ground. I know I have it out in the Monocacy area of Frederick County, over down here, South County. If you ride down to Shady Side or Galesville, you'll see some off of Muddy Creek. And so it's definitely in Maryland. I think it's upwards of maybe like 7 million acres of land in the Southwest, public and private.
Oh.
And this was brought in like the late 1800s at some sort of world fair. Another genius idea of ours. And then, so foliar sprays that you'll see, one recommendation is really just so August, October is kind of best timing for foliar. I've seen a broader window for the cut stem approach of April to August. When I see kudzu, though, there's really nothing there but kudzu. So I almost feel like it would just about always be foliar when I see it in the settings that it's in. But not to say that the one stand I know, it's all over the trees too, but man, it is really blanketed the entire field in front. There is just as a side note, a biocontrol bug that was also mistakenly brought in. The kudzu bug showed up in like 2009. And it's been found far north as the central part of our state. So I don't think it's really doing anything, but it's here. Maybe it'll grow and be a helpful biocontrol, but who knows? Okay. And then we're on to mile a minute. So for ID, I feel this one just because of, those equilateral, those triangle leaves. They're pretty easy to spot. There are barbs on the underside of them. And then you also have that really almost like metallic bright berries that are like blue to purple. And the fruits usually ripen in mid-July. These actually have a seed viability span of 5 to 6 years. So if you have it and it repeatedly gets to fruit and seed, you figure that set of seed is going to last for 5 to 6 years, and then you'll have the next seed set. So to me, particularly when I deal with a lot of organic landowners, it's all about managing this problem the best we can. A lot of times, if you can't do anything, at least just, cut it and beat it before it gets to seed set. And this is like younger invasive, I guess. It is like 1930s. It was brought in the late 1800s, but they trace back to where it really didn't get established and take over until like contaminant of nursery stock in like the 30s. And it is native to India and Eastern Asia. Doesn't grow a mile a minute, but 6 inches a day. You'll see heights of 25 foot in a single season. And I don't know, the most interesting or thing I guess I geek out the most on, not that it's good, but it's fascinating, is just the seeds can float. They say they have buoyancy for up to like 9 days. And if you look at sort of our precipitation events and flooding events and current climate, this might be one that might be traveling a lot more. For large areas of infestation, that they'll mention maybe a pre-emergent that you would apply to soil early to mid-March. But again, a foliar spray before it becomes like a sizable plant, and definitely before it's that seed. And there's a weevil out there, apparently, a mile-a-minute weevil. Again, maybe another biocontrol or another problem that's introduced. I don't know, but it's out there.
Thanks, Francis, and thank you,
Thank
Nina,
you.
for going over vines. So I think we forgot to mention it earlier is vines are our like #1 priority for saving the forest, because they can actually literally take down the trees of the forest, and then you don't have a forest anymore. So that's why we focused on the ones that we see the most, at least around here on our properties. And then we're going to get into shrubs next. So that's one layer down that we're going to save. And then, whenever we have any resources left, we go after grasses. So vines top priority, then shrubs, then grasses is how we try and prioritize our resources for saving forests. All right, and Evan, you want to take it away with shrubs?
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. So that was a good little segue into how you basic plant classifications. So she mentioned vines. We've talked about ground covers real quick that we'll tackle at some point, but those are lowest. And then you got trees, which we're trying to save. And now we're talking about shrubs. So shrubs, the dictionary definition is a woody plant smaller than a tree that has several main stems arising at or near the ground. So those qualifiers there at the end, several stems rather than one, usually with the tree, and at or near the ground is when it starts to, they start going out. So rather than one big stalk, it's coming out from the ground in many different places. It makes them harder to kill, and that makes them very successful in their propagation. So we're going to start with autumn olive, and this is one that we are targeting specifically at Bacon Ridge. There are some big, nasty hot spots of this. This is a contractor job mostly because they are so bad back there, but there's still some areas that we are working on with the volunteers. So we'll educate you a little bit. I imagine if you got these in your backyards, it's been tough to try to get rid of them. So they are also invasive, brought from Asia around the 1800s, and these were brought for ornamental reasons. Also food for wildlife in certain areas, and they were planted for soil erosion. This was a practice back in the 1800s, early 1900s, where they thought just put any plant that can grow prolifically into a place that needs to help with erosion and let it do its thing. So that's how a lot of these were brought and passed around and have spread so much. And they're currently still actually used for some projects, including on roads and ridges. But we don't like them because they choke out most of the rest of the forest. So the autumn olive is very prolific. It seeds, it covers a lot of shades a lot of different areas and kills out all the natives. And its seeds are very easy to distribute. They are usually distributed through those berries. That's why the animals love them, very sweet berries. And they can then go with birds that can travel across great distances. So these guys can get up to 200,000, 200,000 seeds a year per plant. And I'm sure those are the bigger ones, but that's a lot of seeds that can then be traveling all over the place. Their leaves are out from early in the spring until late fall. So that shade is really devastating for all the plants around it. And a very interesting thing about autumn olive is it actually fixes nitrate in the ground using its own chemicals processes, which helps it then find its nitrate, but then it over nourishes the soil around it. And what usually happens then is other weeds come in and start to take over and don't have a lot of room for the natives that we are more delicate in there. And so it's doing two bad things by shading out the rest of the forest and then also changing the soil composition. It's so impactful actually that when you got them along rivers, along the banks of rivers, it puts nitrogen into the water, which can then kill all the plants in the water and affects all the wildlife. So these things are nasty, and they're shrubs, but they grow like weeds and they're really tough to get rid of. So quick ID is they've got the grayish green leaves. They're kind of silvery, scaly on the bottom. They look almost shimmery. They've got sort of a brown gray roots and stems with red speckles. They often have thorns on them up to 1 inch long, and then they have yellow flowers in clusters in the springtime. But mostly it's these fruit you can notice. They're silver until they ripen in the fall and become red, very sweet, and then all the critters like to get them and take the seeds everywhere. So as I mentioned, they're really good at growing in shady areas, but they can also grow out in the sunlight, forest edges, sand dunes. They don't really care. It's just as long as they can get their roots in the ground, they're gonna do well. I mentioned the nitrogen fixing, and that's a unique, specific characteristic. And so they germinate so easily that it makes it difficult to tackle. Healthy forests, as I mentioned, we've got contractors out there doing the volunteer work or doing the big work, but the volunteers are just doing the little stuff. So if we see baby plants where they're still young, they look herbaceous, they haven't really grafts in there, we'll try to get those things by pulling them out by hand. And that's just a good practice as long as you can get them out by hand, all of the roots, and you don't disturb the soil too much. Because you can imagine if you're churning up all the soil, all the seeds that are around that plant in that plant area can then get into the soil and germinate. So you don't want to mess with the soil too much. But then, as I mentioned with the contractors, and Francis touched on this, the best method we found is the cut and dab. We want to protect areas around these trees, but we got to get these trees. So that's cutting it, dabbing the chemicals right onto the stump. And we found that 60% of the trees, or the shrubs, excuse me, are killed off that first round of cut dab. And then the contractors are coming out. We're trying to do every year, maybe a couple times a year, to do this method. That's the best way. Is you just got to keep coming back and checking it. If you don't put that pesticide or that herbicide, excuse me, on the stem, it will grow back even more aggressively. These things are pretty nasty. So we got contractors going over the big portions, and then we're handling kind of the satellite clusters that they call them as the volunteers. So if you got them in your backyard, try the chemical method if you can, if it's very controlled. But that's what we're trying to do is just get them while they're young, stop that seed propagation. That's what we really focus on with our volunteer days at Healthy Forest. So that quickly is autumn olive. Now we'll move on to my favorite ones. Francis has got his favorite. Well, my favorite is multiflora rose. Quite the relationship with the multiflora rose. I've got cuts and scars all over my body because they are nasty with their little thorns. So they, again, are very good to easy to germinate. They're all over the place. You've seen them in the backyards. They're very pretty. The roses are pretty, but overall, they're very bad for choking out the rest of life. So they too came from Asia, from Japan during the Civil War era, and they were used as rootstock for ornamental rose gardens. So when you wanted your garden to grow quickly and have lots of roses, they were used to help them propagate. They are also used as living fences to keep livestock separated because they grow in such big, thick clusters. A fun fact about them is the tip of the rose, when it touches the ground, so it goes up, grows, keeps growing, touches the ground again, it then re-roots and creates one of those tunnel effects, which help it to get these big, huge clusters and choke everything out. So that was desirable for a while to create fences, and as well as soil erosion control, just like the autumn olive. They were actually given out for free by the U.S. Soil and Conservation Service beginning of the 20th century. Free of charge, plant these roses. They're helping with a lot of things. We don't think they're that bad, but now we understand that they are pretty darn hard to get rid of. So the biggest thing that they do, besides choking out all the light and shading the lower ground cover and making it hard for understory, is they are the most prolific seed spreaders I've ever heard of. New plants, mature plants can get almost 1 million seeds out there into the world per year. Millions of seeds per year for these big plants. And these seeds last 20 years in the ground and can germinate up to 20 years. So millions of seeds per plant, 20-year time frame. That makes them just really, really aggressive. And it's no wonder why they're all over the place. So for our Healthy Forest program, we've decided to tackle what we want to do mostly is that seed spread, stopping the seed spread. So we focus with the volunteers 20 feet on either side of the trails. We cut down what we can, we eradicate what we can. We keep coming back to the same areas if we need to, because seed spread is so important. We're trying not to get it throughout the rest of Bacon Ridge. So just quickly to ID them, they're easy because they have these compound, it's called a pinnately compound leaf, which means you look at these leaf clusters, and that's actually one leaf with little leafettes. So there's 5 to 11, excuse me, always an odd number of leafettes on the leaf, the compound leaf, and then they have very distinct curving towards the ground thorns. So you might see greenbrier out there with thorns that go straight out. These curve towards the ground. They'll hook you and they'll just get all over your clothes, but they're actually really smart because then that does help get animals in, get the seeds on the animal, and then disperse. So they, as I mentioned, they are very tolerant of many different environments. They're in open woodlands, at forest edges and in their sun, in the shade, successional fields, savannas, prairies, all over the place. Mostly if areas have been disturbed, because when an area gets disturbed, it's harder for those native, more sensitive plants to come back. The weeds take over quicker because they're better at growing in those harsh conditions. So that's where you will find them. That's why we see them a lot in Bacon Ridge on the top of hillsides where there were farms, and then now they're in their secondary succession. Easier to grow into those conditions for these weedy shrubs. So as I mentioned, we're handling it by the 25-foot wide trail or along the trail and trying to tackle them before they can seed. We will just cut the ones that we can with clippers. We'll pull out the little babies. And if it gets big and we have to saw them, we will saw them. And so we just see that seed dispersion is the most important part. We realize we're going to have to come back and do that a couple times to actually eradicate them. It'll take many years. But we've got 90 acres we're looking at getting taken care of in Bacon Ridge, targeted. We've already done 10 acres of last year. We got 24 on the books this year. It's just going to take time. And eventually we'll have to come back and check it all out and keep redoing it anyway. So it's one of my favorites just because it's so easy to identify. And once you've seen them, you'll see them everywhere, but it'll hook you, and they're pretty nasty to get rid of. But what's nice is we do fill up bags really quick with this. It's a good weight to pull out, and we feel pretty good once we've gotten these out of the area. One more final thing to mention is Francis helped me understand that there is a biological pathogen that is actually natural occurring that we're looking at as maybe an answer for getting rid of these things, or at least knocking them down. It's a rosette disease, and it started out in the Western US. It's now migrated east. It's all over the state in almost every county. Francis said he's been seeing it. It's transferred by mites and seed infesting wasps. So it's these natural agents making this disease coming out east, and it won't just kill them out, which is good because we don't want something that powerful, but it is knocking them down, making it harder for them to grow and get into their flowering. So it's something that the nature's kind of trying to do to take back over and balance out, but it's obviously a project that our volunteers can make more of a difference on. So that's why we do our Healthy Forest Days. We've got some great Healthy Forest Days coming up on October 22nd. Sunday is our next public day. And then we are looking for, if you know anybody that's a group, a church, a school, a corporation wanting to have a day outside, to have them talk to me. Our details will be at the end of this, but I'm arranging it. We're trying to get 20 work days on the book at least next year on the books. And it's a great thing because you can see the work being done at Bacon Ridge, and we're all pretty proud of it. So I'll finish that up with the multiflora rose, and then we'll pass it back to Nina. Going to talk a little bit more about some Japanese barberry. Take it away, Nina. Nina's still here.
Nina, you're not muted.
Sorry
There
about
you
that.
are.
Here she is.
So Japanese barberry is an ornamental plant that shockingly is still being sold in nurseries. So my biggest advice would be don't buy it, and try to get your neighbors to either get it out of their yards or show them why it can be bad. It's pretty easy to identify. It's got little thorns. It varies from greenish to purple. It can handle sun and shade. It's got these actually quite pretty berries that grow and mature. It is you can remove it by either pulling it, digging it, cutting it, or burning it. You can cut it back and then just keep cutting it. If you don't want to, if it's too big to dig out, you can cut it back and then just keep cutting it so that it finally exhausts itself, because the roots can't supply enough energy to keep regrowing the top. It's very invasive, and if you go to Waterworks Park, which is near Annapolis, you can see it growing in the woods there. I'm not sure what the source of that was, but these berries, I'm sure, are carried by animals and distributed outside of homeowner areas. The one thing that is very convincing to people to maybe get rid of it is that there have been studies done that show that it harbors deer ticks. And that's because it's high humidity in there. It's very protective because of the thorns, so that white-footed mice, who are a vector for the deer ticks, like it under there because they're protected from predators. So they've done studies where they've shown that the prevalence of deer ticks under these Japanese barberries is much higher than the surrounding area. So if you can't get a person to get rid of it because they should just get rid of it. You can do it because maybe appealing to their health concerns will be more of a convincing argument for them. So since we don't have that much time for questions and answers, I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Nina.
Mhm.
And so I think we wanted to just give a quick shout out to two very invasive trees that we'd be remiss to add. So Francis, I think you wanted to mention these.
Yeah, I'll be quick just because I want to give people a chance for questions. The tree of heaven, I think a good number of people know, and actually both these are sort of just like planning and zoning mistakes made by many towns and cities, where they're used as street trees just because of their hardiness, and they've continued to spread. Tree of heaven, the best ID tip honestly is the smell test. Crunch the leaf, it'll smell like burnt peanut butter.
Burnt peanut
Bradford
butter.
and Bradford pear is just first to flower, white flower you'll see in just about every highway swale. I mean, it is really the earliest to flower and has these pretty lethal spurs on it. But I just wanted to mention these just because they're so prolific and really everywhere.
Thanks, Francis. All right, and thank you all speakers for giving that wonderful rundown of some of our worst offenders for forest health in terms of invasive plants. So we have like 7 or 8 minutes for questions. Please feel free to type it into the chat, and if you can't type into the chat, you can feel free to come off mute and ask your question that way. Oh, and I guess I could go to the question slide.
John Atwood asked a question in
Yep.
chat.
So the question is, why is Evan keeps mentioning 20 feet, and why is that? Evan, you want to explain?
Sure. So we realized we can only do so much work in this large, awesome Bacon Ridge area. So the trailheads or along the trails is where we push out 20 feet on either side in order to stop that seed spread. So there are some areas still left that we got to tackle where the rows and the other invasives come right up against the trail. And you can imagine a dog or even yourself brushing alongside, you get the seed dispersion, you attach it to your clothes, you can take it throughout the rest of the forest. So we're focused on these 20 feet sides of the trail because it's good for seed dispersion, tackling that. And then it's easy for our volunteers to access. It's a nice little hike in. We take groups along the trail. It's never too steep or throughout the park. It's pretty moderate. And that just allows easy access. We can go and then you can see the difference. We've got some great before and after shots of where we've been compared to where we haven't been. But that's the main reason is we've got these 20 feet on either side, these buffer zones. There are large areas throughout the park that we're going to try to get into. It's just a little bit harder to access them, especially during summertime. And the contractors are going over the big hot spots, but that's the volunteer 20 feet on either side of the trail that you can really go see when you start paying attention.
And so it's particularly easy access for volunteers. And then as we control those areas and have them pretty well, under control, we'll be working farther off the trail. All right, anybody else have any?
Just as an aside to that kind of illustrates Evan's point, I've hiked a lot in Bacon Ridge, and there's another invasive there called wavy leaf basket grass. And that has sticky seeds that kind of attach to your pant legs. And I noticed a few months later after being at Bacon Ridge that I had wavy leaf basket grass growing in my gravel driveway because I guess it had just dropped off my pant leg when I got out of the car. And
wow.
So you don't know what you're bringing back with you. And so that strategy of 20 feet on either side is to minimize that sort of carrying of seeds that you don't want to distribute.
That's a great example, Nina. Thank you for sharing. That's awesome.
Sure.
Yeah. Or not awesome.
Yeah.
Terrible, but so
however,
impactful.
luckily I recognized it as wavy leaf basket grass and I yanked it out of my driveway, so it's not there any longer.
That's good. So Nina, you have a question from Elizabeth Rosborg. She wants to know what your favorite tools are. I know you mentioned a mini saw, but what else do you like taking out into the woods?
I have them right here. 1 second.
I know we usually go out there with glasses and just like hand
And
pruners,
clippers. Yep.
hand trimmers.
The Hori knife is an excellent tool. It's
You're
very,
on your sorry, your screen sharing question and answers right now, Nina, so we can't see you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Can you see me now?
Yes.
Can you see the Hori knife? It's a very sturdy piece of equipment. This is really thick stainless steel. It's on this side, it's just smooth, but on this side it actually has serrations. You can even use it like a mini saw. It's just very sturdy, and it's great for getting behind the ivy in particular and popping it off the bark, so that you can actually get behind it and then you have more access to be able to cut it. So this is one of my favorite tools. It's also really good for just digging in the ground and getting out seedlings. So my bag of tricks here. This is the mini chainsaw, which everybody who uses this at our volunteer events, well, they're not allowed to use it at the volunteer. When they see it at the volunteer events, they then go out and they buy their own. It's not that expensive, usually less than $100, but it's really effective, and it's very easy to use with one hand and get some of the really nasty vines that you can't get with just a regular Hori knife or other tool. And then just regular pruners. I would recommend getting a really good set of pruners. So I have some in here like Felco's, because the ones that are kind of cheap, like this one, just they tend to break after a while and don't stay that sharp. And then always wear gloves, and I would recommend, it's hard to do in the summertime because it's just too hot, but wear a full set of clothes that hopefully permethrin treated, because the ticks in particular have been really bad. I've been having COVID and I've hardly been outside, and I had 3 deer tick on me this week. Did you have any specific questions about these tools or other tools?
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. And also one thing to add to that, I have just discovered, and I can run and go get it, deer tick repellent lotion that you can put on, that I'm told from a friend that works really well.
Oh, can you put the name of that in the chat?
I will.
Okay,
I will.
that'd be great.
I was curious about the mini saw, but then I was also, it's hard to get between the vines and the tree.
Yeah,
And
that's where this thing.
Yeah.
And you don't want to use your loppers or your pruners for that. We have one woman who, another co-founder of Save Our Trees, who was very dismayed to find that one of the volunteers used 2 of her tools and completely destroyed them from torquing off of the tree. So yeah, this is designed for that.
Yeah. And I'll have to find it too, because there's also another organization, Save Our Trees, but they're also, and I'll share it in the chat too, where volunteers will come out and help you strip the trees.
Yeah, that's we do.
Okay.
We have a bunch of volunteers. If anybody would love to volunteer for our upcoming events or see what they are, go to saveourtrees.org and you can look and see upcoming events.
Oh, great. I'll share those in the chat. Thanks, Nina.
So much.
And for Japanese honeysuckle and English ivy, if you want to avoid hot summer days with long sleeves, they're evergreen, so you can tackle them in the middle of winter. Get yourself out of the
best
house.
time.
Yeah,
because you're not dealing with poison ivy leaves hanging in your face. I mean, you still have to worry about the stem, but you can just actually get to the vines a lot more easily in the winter than the summer.
Yeah. Well, does anyone else have any other questions? I think that's RJ, which I'm guessing is Rose. Just a note on permethrin, it's highly toxic to cats, so just keep away from your pets if you want to use that. Well, we will wrap up this webinar. Thank you so much for coming and joining us for our little chat. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to send us send them via email or call us. We'll be sending out the recording of the webinar, which will have our contact information on one of the very last slides. And again, please join us for our volunteer days for Save Our Trees or for our Healthy Forest Days. And I hope you get out there and you win against your invasives on your properties. All right. Thank you again, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.